So, I am now going to ask you to come with me on a trip across the world. Starting from Asia, we will be going through Africa and arriving in my hometown, Rome. A few years ago, I was on holiday in Bangkok. And when I arrived, I decided that from the town center I would take a taxi to my hotel. And having queued for my taxi, I give the address to the taxi driver, who explains to me that there were demonstrations, famous demonstrations in Bangkok, you might remember, and that because of them, it was impossible to reach my hotel with a car. So I was a bit annoyed because I was quite tired after my trip. But then I realized that there was an alternative. There were moto taxis, as they called them there. In other words, I hauled a motorbike, and I had my two rucksacks. I put one in the front, one on the back. And after a reasonable ride, in about 20 minutes, I reached my hotel. And I had realized then during the trip that indeed a car would not have been able to drive me that far and that fast. Moving on from Bangkok now, we're going to Africa. And I read this very interesting article about a startup company in Kigali, in Rwanda, which provides a service which is similar to the one that I used when I was in Bangkok. And the easiest way to explain how it works to you is to compare it to Uber. You all know this very famous, indeed controversial app, I'm sure. Some of you are guilty of having taken an Uber ride in Brussels, as myself. This company, Safe Motors, has its own application. And you can, therefore, when you're in Kigali, indicate that you want to get a ride, and soon enough you will have a driver at your disposal. You will also know beforehand the cost of your ride. Now, Safe Motors in Kigali so far sounds just like Uber. But the first difference you have understood is that it doesn't provide cars, but motorbikes, which are a great idea because there's an awful lot of traffic in Kigali and the town is very congested. And the other difference is that, besides the fact that, of course, these drivers, just like Uber drivers, also get points, and the more points you give them, the more likely they are to be called in the future. But the difference is that these motorbikes are equipped with an accelerometer, which means that the speed at which the drivers will accelerate can be measured. And if the company notices that these drivers are a bit reckless, then they will be penalized, and they might risk either just not getting so many customers, but in the end being actually excluded from the company. There's a very good reason for this, is because previously there had been similar attempts to provide this kind of service, but there had been complaints about precisely the recklessness of the local drivers. And in other words, they have this data which is recorded in the accelerometer, which is sent off to the sort of headquarters of the company. And if the driver has been inclined to feel that he was in a sort of GP race and driving like Valentino Rossi, then the likelihood is he won't be called again. And in other words, prudence, cautiousness is one of the key values of this startup, which I think is a great idea. Now, those of you who know me in Brussels know that I move around on a bike, but I am generally a fan of two wheels. And in fact, in Rome, I actually ride a scooter. And I thought of this startup in Kigali and thought of how it would be really well suited for Rome, because Rome has a huge congestion problem, has an enormous number of motorbikes and scooters, and it actually, a couple of years ago, started using the services of a company called Scooterino, which is like Uber again, but on two wheels. But, as you might imagine, Roman drivers, including myself, are also reckless. I don't know how reckless they are compared to the ones in Kigali, but I think that maybe having an accelerometer placed on the motorbikes or scooters of Scooterino might be a very good idea. Scooterino has already obtained some funding, about 50,000 euros from the European Space Agency. I don't know why the Space Agency, but I think right for now they plan just to be traveling on the ground, but you never know. And if we were to include this accelerometer, it would not only be good for tourists in Rome, but for once we would have a technology transfer that would come from the south of the world to the north. You know, we're always talking about how knowledge and skills and technology are being transferred from the wealthier parts and the more advanced parts of the world to the poorer ones. Well, we now have something which would come from Africa and go to Italy. And so, yeah, let's hope that this technology is implemented there too, so that if Roman drivers with tourists at the back of their motorbike feel inclined to tear through the city risking life and limb, they might have to think again, given that they might be penalized for doing so. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that Kigali is the new Silicon Valley, but it might nevertheless contribute with this small piece of technology to help Romans and all the tourists who come to admire the beauties of the, well, most beautiful city in the world, of course.